Good morning, and welcome to this series of web discussions on political economy analysis in action. This morning, I'm going to be talking to Sue Unsworth, who is the lead author of the EC discussion paper on using political economy analysis to improve EU development effectiveness. Sue's worked for 30 years with the UK's Department for International Development, most recently holding posts of Regional Director for Asia and Chief Governance Advisor. She was one of the main initiators of DFID's Drivers of Change program and the Netherlands Foreign Ministry Strategic Governance and Corruption Assessments. Good morning, Sue.
Morning, Gareth.
I wonder if we could start, if I could put you on the spot and ask you if you could explain in a nutshell, in jargon-free language, what exactly is meant by political economy analysis?
Political economy analysis helps you investigate the political processes of bargaining at work between different interest groups in a particular context, so a country context or a sector context. And these bargaining processes matter because they're the mechanisms through which different groups can come together and organize what we call collective action. That means action that requires cooperation between individuals or groups. So, for example, in order to organize basic security or to agree arrangements to resolve disputes peacefully or to organize trade or production or services.
I mean, this all sounds highly political. I'm wondering where is the economics in this, because after all it is political economy analysis.
The relationships between people who hold political power or political and military power and people who hold economic power, those relationships are really crucial for development outcomes. Politicians need private capital to provide government with revenue and to finance political parties, and investors need the state or some kind of political authority to provide protection of property rights and physical and financial infrastructure. So both parties potentially gain by cooperating. There are win-wins from cooperating. But very often what happens is that they compete in unproductive ways. So politicians predate on private capital by, for example, punitive taxes or just by looting. And people with capital, people with economic power, can organize violent opposition, or they can use that power to capture the state. So that relationship between state and business, between politicians and investors, between people with political power, people with economic power, is absolutely critical for creating the conditions for development, the conditions in which business has incentives to invest productively and politicians have incentives to nurture economic growth.
I mean, this sounds like quite a radical departure from conventional ways of thinking about development. Do you think that political economy analysis requires donors to think differently about how development happens?
Absolutely. I think for really most of the time that I was with DFID and was working as a development practitioner, people simply didn't stop to ask themselves what assumptions they were making about how development happens. There was a kind of implicit assumption that the problem was lack of finance or lack of technical or organizational skills. And the question about what sort of local political processes were involved in nurturing development and providing the incentives for development was something that was simply never asked.
So was there a particular moment in your career when you realized that donors simply had to think in political economy terms?
Yes and no. I have a degree in history, so I've always been interested in how processes of social, political, economic change happen and why they produce different outcomes in different circumstances. So in a sense, I always had a feeling that donors weren't sufficiently interested in how development had happened in their own countries. But I think it was my experience in India in the late 1990s that really sparked my interest in how politics affects development. Because India is a democracy, and poor people do go out and vote in elections. So the question is, why haven't they been more successful in pushing their interests as poor people? Politicians make all sorts of promises at election time, but they don't feel a particular need then to deliver on those promises. And we did a study of voting patterns in a very poor state, in Orissa. And what was clear from that was that poor people were not mobilizing around a common agenda as poor people. Instead, their votes were fragmented according to different identities of religion and caste and loyalty to a particular local patron. And that brought home to me the need to investigate how different interest groups are organizing and how that affects incentives of politicians to deliver on promises of development.
Now, we've seen over the past couple of years that a number of donor agencies, like DFID, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the World Bank, and now the European Commission, are all adopting political economy analysis tools. I wonder if there's a danger here that this is just another passing fad or development fashion, or do you think there really is a meaningful shift in thinking taking place?
If you compare the kind of internal debates that are taking place today within the main donor agencies with the kind of discussion that prevailed 10 years ago, I think you can see a big shift. 10 years ago, no one was talking about politics or political economy. Those words weren't even in the donor vocabulary. And these days, virtually every major donor is undertaking some form of political economy analysis. Plus, there's an increasing focus on fragile states, which is forcing people to think about conflict dynamics and state building, and political economy issues are central to both of those. And also experience has shown that trying to create better governance by just providing financial and technical support for formal institutions in poor countries doesn't work very well. So I do think political economy analysis is changing the way donors think about development. But I think it's had less impact on what they actually do, partly because they're driven by very strong bureaucratic and domestic political incentives to show short-term results, to pursue quite a normative agenda sometimes, to demonstrate that large amounts of financial and technical aid can make a big impact. And so I think there is a risk that people end up expecting too much of political economy analysis. They expect it somehow to deliver a menu of a whole lot of new things they can try to do to promote development. I think there's a risk that they become disillusioned, and in that sense, it could be that the present enthusiasm for political economy analysis does diminish.
I mean, I think what's needed here really is some practical examples of how this type of thinking can really make a difference in practice at the operational level. Are you able to give us some ideas and examples of where you've seen it really making a difference on the ground?
One of the best examples I know, which we do talk about in the concept paper, is the EU's Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Programme, the FLEGT programme, which is really political economy in action. It uses EU market power as a major importer of tropical timber to provide very powerful incentives for governments and business in timber-producing countries to tackle illegal logging. So it's using that knowledge of political economy to try to shift incentives of important actors. And then the second thing it's doing is supporting local multi-stakeholder processes that bring together government, business, civil society actors to tackle forest governance problems. And in bringing those groups together, the impact seems to have been that people start to understand that they have interests in common, they start to break down barriers of distrust, and they start to see ways of solving collective action problems. So that's a very good example of directly applying political economy analysis to program design. But I think also often political economy analysis doesn't necessarily mean that you do a whole lot of different things. It also means that you do a lot of the things you're already doing differently. And that was something that we recognized when we discussed political economy analysis this summer in the EU delegation in Lusaka. So, for example, people there identified the need to find a more politically compelling narrative when they're engaging in policy dialogue or political dialogue, to try to differentiate between policy options that might be politically feasible and those that are just politically not feasible, recognize the importance of empowering Zambian policymakers, for example, with really good quality research, engaging local people to find politically attractive ways of disseminating that research. So there are a whole lot of ways in which thinking about political economy analysis can change the way in which you behave and operate as a donor.
Okay, so thinking about donors and zooming in particular on the European Commission, why would you say the European Commission should be interested in political economy analysis? I mean, how is this going to make a difference to the effectiveness of its development cooperation?
Well, first of all, if you recognize that development happens primarily through local political processes, then you have to, as an external actor engaging with those processes, you have to understand what's going on. But I think there's mounting evidence that if donors don't understand those local political economy dynamics, they can actually do harm inadvertently. Aid can do harm, particularly in fragile states. For example, it can undermine incentives for local collective action. It can undermine local accountability. It can sometimes even destroy local informal institutions that are working well. And then on a more positive note, I think donors can see opportunities that they didn't see if they understand political economy dynamics, and they understand how an external intervention is engaging with local incentives and pressures for change. So that, for example, they would ask themselves where there might be some overlap between the Commission's objectives in a country and the interests of powerful actors, instead of just pushing their own policy agenda. Or they'd be looking for ways to try to bring together different local actors to facilitate constructive discussion and identification of common interests and so forth.
So can you tell us a bit about the discussion paper that you've been working on? What's the paper setting out to do, and how should people be using it?
Well, there are two bits to it. There's a main concept paper, and then there are two annexes that provide practical guidance. The concept paper is really important because, as I've been saying all along in this conversation, one of the main things I think that political economy analysis does is to change the way people think about development. So the concept paper sets out some of the basic thinking about political economy and how it works and why it matters. And then there are two annexes, one of which gives some guidance on the sort of questions you would want to ask if you were doing political economy analysis at a country level, and the other one adapts the same structure of questions to investigate sector-level issues. And there are three sort of parts to the analysis. First of all, it prompts you to think about what we call foundational factors. So these are things that fundamentally shape the social, political, institutional landscape of a country, that make the difference between Zambia and Kenya and Tanzania. And they look at things like the history of state formation, sources of public revenue, embedded social and economic structures, a country's geography, a country's geostrategic position. These are things which tend to change rather slowly. And then the second unit of analysis is something we call rules of the game, which looks at the formal and informal institutions that are shaping the way the main actors are behaving. They shape the incentives and capacity of key actors, relationships between them, and look at things like the distribution of power, the extent to which institutions follow known transparent public rules that apply to everyone or are highly personalized and exclusive, or the way in which political competition is conducted. And those are things which can be quite sticky, but where there is the possibility of changing people's perception of their interests and the incentives that shape behavior over the more medium term. And then we look at what we call the here and now, which is how day-to-day politics is playing out, and how particular events, so a forthcoming election or a financial crisis or a natural disaster, is shaping opportunities. And I think this structure is really helpful in trying to help people distinguish between things that are probably very hard to change over the short to medium term, things where there might be the possibility of changing interests and incentives over the more medium term, and then short-term opportunities, which can sometimes trigger quite big change, or can be actually quite hard to sustain.
And you've been testing this analytical framework in Zambia. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how you felt that exercise went and how valuable it was.
I thought it was really valuable, and to me what it emphasized was the crucial importance of having the key people in the delegation engaged. So the good thing about Zambia was that we were actually invited to pilot the framework there, that the head of delegation and the head of operations and his team were all really enthusiastic about it. What I think it demonstrated was that this framework, and using this framework, it doesn't necessarily tell people who live in Zambia things that they didn't already know, but it does help them to structure that knowledge. It helps them to see the significance of knowledge that they already have. It helps to legitimize that knowledge. And I thought that came out really well in the workshop discussion that we had with people in the delegation and with member states and the World Bank. And there was a sense that people were using knowledge that sometimes is knowledge that is only used in unofficial discussions after work in the bar. They were finding ways in which that knowledge could actually be applied to how you do business day to day.
Sue, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It's been fascinating talking to you, and we look forward to your further contributions to this debate over the next couple of weeks on the Capacity for Dev EU website.